He asked for a quiet wife, someone to cook his meals and keep his house, someone who would never ask questions about his past. What he got instead was a woman with blood on her hands, a wanted outlaw with a $500 bounty on her head, a ghost who had been running for 6 years from a crime she did not commit. And she was about to discover that the man who destroyed her life was the most powerful judge in the territory. This is the story of Ruth McAllister, the woman they called Red Hawk, the bride who rode into Cimarron with secrets dark enough to get them both killed. But here is the twist nobody saw coming. The cowboy she married? He had secrets of his own. He was a former Texas Ranger who had killed his own brother. And together these two broken souls would burn down an empire built on lies. Cowboy wanted a quiet wife, got a wild one who rode him till dawn. This story carries a powerful message about second chances and redemption. It reminds us that our past does not define our future, that the worst thing we have ever done is not the final word on who we are, and that sometimes the person who seems most broken is exactly the person we need to help us become whole. The moral is simple but profound. We are not what was done to us. We are not even what we have done. We are what we choose to become. Every single day, we get to make that choice again. And love? Real love does not ask you to hide who you are. It sees your scars and stays anyway. If this story touched your heart, if you felt something when Ruth finally found her home, then do me a small favor. Hit that like button. It tells me you want more stories like this one. The westbound Santa Fe train was 3 hours late. Silas Cade stood on the weathered platform of Cimarron Station, hat pulled low against the blood-red sunset, watching dust devils dance across the empty street. He had been waiting since noon, and the afternoon heat had long since baked the patience out of him. But he kept waiting. A man did not place an advertisement for a mail-order bride and then abandon her at the station because the train ran behind schedule. 6 months ago, old Tom had planted the idea in his head while they mended fence line in the south pasture. The old vaquero had a way of saying things that stuck with a man, words that burrowed under the skin and refused to leave. A man with nothing to lose ain't got nothing to live for neither, Jefe. You built this ranch with your own 2 hands, but a house ain't a home without someone to share it with. Silas had dismissed the notion at first. He was 34 years old, set in his ways, carrying enough ghosts to fill a cemetery. What woman in her right mind would want a man like him? But old Tom had persisted, kept leaving copies of the Matrimonial Gazette on the kitchen table, kept mentioning how the Henderson widow had remarried and seemed happier than a pig in sunshine, kept pointing out that the cabin needed a woman's touch, that Silas needed someone to cook proper meals instead of the burned beans and bitter coffee he managed on his own. Finally, Silas had relented. He had written a careful advertisement, choosing each word with the same precision he had once used to track outlaws across the Texas plains. Seeking quiet, modest wife. Must know household duties. No questions asked about the past. That last line was for himself as much as for her. Whatever woman answered his advertisement would have her own reasons for leaving everything behind and traveling 1,000 miles to marry a stranger. He would not pry. He expected the same courtesy in return. 3 women had responded. 2 had sent photographs that looked like they belonged in a saloon rather than a farmhouse. The 3rd had sent no photograph at all, just a simple letter written in neat, educated handwriting. Dear Mr. Cade, my name is Ruth McAllister. I am 26 years old, recently widowed, and seeking a fresh start in the Western Territories. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, and tend a garden. I am quiet by nature, and ask only for a roof over my head and a chance to build a respectable life. I have no family to leave behind. If you will have me, I will be a good wife to you. Respectfully yours, Ruth McAllister. Something about her letter had spoken to him. The loneliness between the lines, the desperate hope wrapped in proper grammar, the unspoken pain of a woman with no family and nowhere else to go. He had sent for her immediately, paid for her train ticket, arranged for the preacher to marry them the day she arrived. Now he stood on the platform, palms sweating despite the cooling evening air, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. The train whistle pierced the silence, echoing off the distant mountains like the cry of some great iron beast. Black smoke billowed against the crimson sky as the locomotive thundered into view, wheels screeching against the rails. Silas straightened his shoulders, removed his hat, ran a hand through his dark hair, trying to tame it into something presentable. The train ground to a halt with a great hiss of steam. Passengers began descending from the cars. Drummers in cheap suits hawking patent medicine. A family with too many children and not enough luggage. Two painted ladies heading for the Golden Spur Saloon, their laughter carrying across the platform like breaking glass. Then he saw her. She stepped down from the train with a grace that seemed out of place on the rough wooden platform. Her traveling dress was gray, buttoned high to the throat, practical rather than pretty. Dark hair was pinned beneath a black mourning bonnet, and her eyes were cast downward in proper modesty. Everything about her whispered quiet Eastern widow. A woman who knew her place. A woman who would cause no trouble. She approached him, and when she finally raised her eyes to meet his, Silas felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were green. Not the pale green of prairie grass, but deep and dark, like the forest he had once ridden through in the hill country of East Texas. Eyes that held secrets. Her voice was soft as church hymns when she spoke. "Mr. Cade, I am Ruth. I hope I am what you were looking for." There was something in the way she said it, a careful precision to her words, as if she had rehearsed them. But Silas pushed the thought aside. The woman was nervous, meeting a stranger who would become her husband within the hour. Anyone would be careful with their words. "Ma'am." He nodded, suddenly aware of his own rough appearance, the dust on his boots, the sweat stains on his shirt, the calluses on his hands from years of hard labor. "Welcome to Cimarron." She smiled. It was a small smile, contained and proper, but it softened her face in a way that made her almost pretty. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Cade. I know this arrangement is unusual, but I promise I will do my best to be a good wife." Before he could respond, a shadow fell across them. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Silas turned to find Judge Horatio Blackwood standing behind him, the largest rancher in Cimarron Valley, the most powerful man in the territory, and the closest thing the town had to genuine evil dressed in a Sunday suit. Blackwood was in his late 50s, silver-haired and distinguished with the kind of face that made people trust him on sight. He wore his respectability like a mask, but Silas knew what lay beneath. He had seen the burned-out homesteads, the settlers driven off their land, the families that disappeared in the night, never to be heard from again. Judge Blackwood. Silas kept his voice neutral. "Didn't expect to see you at the station. I make it my business to welcome new residents to our fair town." Blackwood's eyes slid to Ruth, and something flickered in their depths, something that made Silas's hand itch toward his gun. "You must be the new Mrs. Cade. Welcome to Cimarron, my dear." Ruth dipped her head in acknowledgement, the perfect picture of demure femininity. "Thank you, sir. It is a pleasure to meet you. The pleasure is mine, I assure you." Blackwood's smile did not reach his eyes. "I trust Mr. Cade will take proper care of you. The frontier can be dangerous for a woman alone." The emphasis he placed on proper made the words sound like a threat. Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Blackwood and Ruth. "We best be going. Preacher's waiting." Of course, of course." Blackwood tipped his hat, but his eyes never left Ruth's face. "I look forward to seeing you both at church on Sunday. And remember, Mr. Cade, my door is always open if you need anything. Anything at all." He walked away, his silver-headed cane tapping against the wooden platform like a countdown to something terrible. Ruth watched him go, and for just a moment Silas saw something flash across her face. Not fear, exactly. Something harder. Something that disappeared so quickly he could not be certain he had seen it at all. "Who was that man?" she asked quietly. "Nobody worth knowing." Silas picked up her trunk, surprised by its modest weight. Most Eastern women traveled with enough luggage to fill a wagon. She had brought only one trunk and a small carpet bag. "Shall we?" The wagon ride to the church was mostly silent. Ruth sat beside him on the bench seat, her back straight as a ramrod, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The picture of propriety. But Silas noticed things. The way her eyes moved constantly, scanning the buildings they passed, cataloging the people on the street. The way she positioned herself so she could see the road ahead and behind at the same time. The way her fingers occasionally tightened on the fabric of her skirt, the only sign of nerves she showed. When they passed the small cemetery at the edge of town, she spoke for the first time. "Who is buried there?" Silas's hands tightened on the reins. One grave in particular seemed to draw her attention. An unmarked plot near the back, where wild grass grew over a mound of earth and a simple wooden cross had weathered gray with time. Nobody important. She looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment her mask slipped. He saw curiosity in those green eyes. Curiosity and something else. Recognition, perhaps. The look of someone who understood that some graves were better left unmarked. She did not ask again. The wedding was a brief affair. Reverend Whitmore performed the ceremony in the small church with shaking hands, his breath carrying the sharp smell of whiskey. Only old Tom stood witness, his weathered face unreadable as he watched them exchange vows. Ruth spoke her promises in a clear, steady voice, her eyes never leaving Silas's face. She did not blush, did not stammer, did not show any of the nervous excitement a bride was supposed to feel on her wedding day. She recited the words like someone who understood that words were tools, not truths. When it came time for the kiss, she lifted her chin and met his lips with a brief, proper touch. Nothing passionate, nothing that would scandalize the Reverend's disapproving wife, just a seal on a contract. Silas found himself oddly disappointed. As they signed the register, Ruth's handwriting flowing and educated next to his cramped scrawl, Mrs. Whitmore pressed a bundle of biscuits into Ruth's hands. "For the journey to your new home." Her eyes were sympathetic, as if Ruth were heading to her doom rather than her wedding bed. "Bless you, child. You will need all the help the Lord can provide." Ruth thanked her graciously, her smile never wavering. But Silas saw her fingers tighten around the bundle, saw the flash of something in her eyes that might have been anger, or might have been fear. The sun was setting as they drove north toward the ranch, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and crimson. The windmill appeared first, its blades turning lazy in the evening breeze. Then the barn. Then the cabin itself, small but solid, smoke rising from the chimney where old Tom had started a fire in the hearth. "It ain't much." Silas found himself apologizing before he could stop himself. "But it's well built. Roof don't leak. Got good water from the well, and the creek runs through the north pasture." Ruth studied the property with those sharp green eyes. The defensible position on the high ground. The single approach road that could be watched from the porch. The tree line that could provide cover for anyone approaching or escaping. "It is perfect," she said, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost like longing. "Did you build it yourself?" "With some help from neighbors." Silas pulled the wagon up to the front porch. Took near 2 years to get it right. He helped her down, and for a moment her body pressed against his. She smelled of lavender water and something else underneath, something wild, like sage after rain. She stepped away quickly, but not before he noticed the strength in her arms. More strength than an Eastern widow should possess. That night, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they faced each other across the cabin's small main room. The bedroom door stood open behind Ruth, lamplight flickering across the quilt that old Tom's wife had made before she passed. "I know this is sudden." Silas cleared his throat, uncomfortable in a way he had not felt since he was a boy. "If you need time to adjust, I can sleep in the chair." "No expectations." Ruth studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, something like relief crossing her face. "Thank you, Mr. Cade." You are kind. Silas. She blinked. I'm sorry? Call me Silas. Mr. Cade was my father. A small smile touched her lips, the first genuine one he had seen. Then you must call me Ruth. None of this Mrs. Cade business between us. They regarded each other across the lamplit room, two strangers bound by law and necessity, two people with secrets they were not ready to share. Good night, Ruth. Good night, Silas. She closed the bedroom door behind her, and Silas settled into the chair by the fire. Sleep did not come easily. He lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around him. The crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind against the windows, the soft, even breathing of the woman in his bed. Just before dawn, he woke from a light doze with the instinct that had kept him alive through 10 years as a Texas Ranger. Something was wrong. He lay perfectly still, eyes adjusting to the gray pre-dawn light. The cabin was quiet. Ruth's breathing came steady and even from behind the closed bedroom door. But his gun had been moved, the Colt single action that hung on the wall above the fireplace. He kept it cleaned but never loaded. A reminder of who he had been, not who he was trying to become. Someone had taken it down, worked the action, oiled the mechanism, inspected it with the care of someone who knew guns intimately, then put it back in almost the same position. Almost. Silas rose silently from the chair and crossed to the gun. In the dim light, he could see fingerprints in the dust on the barrel. Small fingerprints, a woman's hands. He looked at the bedroom door. Her breathing was too controlled, too even. The breathing of someone pretending to sleep. She knew he had discovered what she had done. She was waiting to see what he would do about it. Silas hung the gun back on its peg and returned to his chair. A quiet wife he had asked for. A modest woman who knew household duties. Instead, he had gotten Ruth McAllister, a woman who knew her way around a Colt single action better than most men. A woman who cataloged exits and watched the road behind her. A woman with secrets buried so deep they might never surface. He should have been worried, should have demanded answers, should have sent her packing on the next train east. Instead, he found himself smiling in the darkness. The quiet life he had built for himself was about to get very, very complicated. Outside, on the ridge overlooking the ranch, Deputy Marshal Marcus Cole lowered his spyglass and made a note in his leather-bound journal. Subject arrived as expected. Married within hours of arrival. Clever disguise. But I would know those eyes anywhere. He closed the journal and tucked it into his saddlebag. Hello, Red Hawk, he whispered to the wind. I finally found you. Morning came with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Silas opened his eyes to find sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and Ruth standing at the stove, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, humming softly as she cooked. She looked different in the daylight. Softer somehow, more real. The gray traveling dress had been replaced by a simple calico that must have been packed in her trunk, and she moved through the kitchen with an ease that suggested she had been cooking breakfast for years, which, Silas supposed, she probably had. Whatever secrets she carried, whatever skills she possessed that no Eastern widow should know, she clearly understood how to keep a household running. You are awake. She did not turn from the stove, but something in her voice told him she had known the moment his breathing changed. Coffee is ready. Breakfast will be done soon. Silas rose from the chair, working the stiffness from his back. The chair was not designed for sleeping, but he had slept in worse places. Much worse. Smells good. Ruth finally turned to face him, and for a moment their eyes met across the small cabin. An understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of what had happened in the night. The gun, the discovery, the silent agreement not to speak of it. Not yet. The advertisement said no questions about the past. Ruth set a plate of bacon and eggs in front of him as he sat at the rough-hewn table. Does that go both ways? Silas considered her across the rim of his coffee cup. She had asked the question carefully, her voice neutral, her face a mask of polite inquiry. But beneath the surface he could sense the tension. The fear that she might have overplayed her hand. Reckon it does. Relief flickered in her green eyes before she concealed it behind a small smile. Then we understand each other. They ate in companionable silence, the morning sun warming the cabin as the sounds of the ranch drifted through the open windows. Old Tom's voice singing something in Spanish. Horses whickering in the corral. The creak of the windmill as it turned in the breeze. When the meal was finished, Ruth washed the dishes with quick, efficient movements, while Silas watched from the doorway. Old Tom will want to meet you proper. He'll be working the horses this morning. You up for a walk? Ruth dried her hands on her apron and met his eyes. I would like that. They found the old vaquero in the corral, brushing down a bay mare with the patient attention of a man who understood that horses gave back exactly what you put into them. He looked up as they approached, his weathered face creasing into a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Jefe. He nodded to Silas, then turned his attention to Ruth. Senora, you sleep well? It was an innocent question, the kind any polite person might ask a new bride after her first night in a strange place. But something in old Tom's voice suggested he knew exactly how she had spent those dark hours. Knew about the gun, knew about the inspection, knew more than he was saying. Very well, thank you. Ruth met his gaze without flinching. Your employer was the perfect gentleman. Old Tom grunted. He often is, Senora. Too often, some might say. He returned to brushing the mare, his eyes never leaving Ruth's face. You know horses? I can learn? He did not sound convinced. But he did not challenge her either, just kept brushing, the rhythm of his movements steady and sure. That mare's name is Rosalind. Silas stepped closer to the fence, watching Ruth's reaction. She's the best cow pony I've got. Smart, fast, loyal as they come. Ruth approached the fence slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. Rosalind's ears pricked forward, and the mare took a step toward her, stretching out her nose to investigate this new human. Ruth let her sniff. Let her investigate. Made no sudden movements, offered no threats. She is beautiful. Ruth's voice was soft, almost reverent. I had a horse like her once, a long time ago. It was the first personal detail she had shared, the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. Silas filed it away for later examination. What happened to her? Ruth's hand froze on Rosalind's neck. For a long moment she did not answer. Then, so quietly he almost missed it. I lost her, along with everything else. Before Silas could respond, Ruth turned from the fence and walked back toward the cabin. Her shoulders were straight, her stride steady, but something in the set of her jaw told him she was holding back tears. Old Tom watched her go, then caught Silas's eye. That one has secrets, Jefe. Deep ones. I know. You going to ask about them? Silas shook his head. She'll tell me when she's ready, or she won't. Either way, it's her choice. Old Tom grunted again. But this time there was something like approval in the sound. Maybe you're smarter than you look after all. The first week passed in a blur of domestic routine. Ruth threw herself into her new role with a dedication that bordered on obsessive. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended clothes and organized the small pantry and swept the porch until the boards gleamed. She asked no questions, made no demands, and went out of her way to be exactly the quiet, modest wife Silas had advertised for. It was perfect, and it was driving him crazy. Because beneath the mask of propriety, he kept catching glimpses of someone else. Someone who knew how to skin a rabbit with 3 quick cuts. Someone who could split firewood with the efficiency of a seasoned hand. Someone who watched the road with the constant vigilance of a person waiting for danger to arrive. The little things piled up like snowdrifts against a cabin wall. The way she positioned herself so her back was never fully to a door or window. The calluses on her palms that came from gripping reins, not needlework. The small knife she kept tucked in her boot, always within reach, always ready. And then there was the night he woke to find her standing at the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape with an expression that could only be described as haunted. He pretended to sleep, watching through slitted eyes as she scanned the darkness for threats that only she could see. Her body was coiled tight, ready to move at a moment's notice, ready to fight or flee. After a long while, she returned to bed and lay perfectly still until dawn. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. On Sunday, they went to church. The entire town turned out to see the new Mrs. Cade, and Ruth played her part to perfection. She wore her gray traveling dress, modest and proper, and kept her eyes downcast as the preacher droned on about sin and salvation. Afterward, the women of Cimarron descended on her like a flock of hungry buzzards. "My dear, you must tell us about yourself." Mrs. Patterson, the general store owner's wife, positioned herself at the front of the group. "Where did you grow up? Who was your family?" Ruth smiled her small, contained smile. "I grew up in Missouri, ma'am, St. Joseph. My father was a shopkeeper." "And your late husband?" Mrs. Henderson, the widow who had recently remarried, leaned forward with undisguised curiosity. "What took him from you?" "Cholera." Ruth's voice did not waver. 2 years ago now. We had no children, no family left. I saw Mr. Cade's advertisement and thought perhaps a fresh start might help heal the grief. The women made sympathetic noises, but Silas could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they studied Ruth's hands for calluses that didn't match her story, the way they examined her face for signs of the painted lady they suspected her of being. Ruth noticed too. He could tell by the way her smile tightened at the corners. But she said nothing, just endured their scrutiny with the patience of someone who had survived far worse. When they finally escaped the churchyard and started the long drive home, Ruth sat beside him in silence for nearly a mile. Then so quietly he almost missed it. "They don't believe me. No." Silas kept his eyes on the road ahead. "They don't. Does that bother you?" He considered the question, considered the woman beside him, with her secrets and her skills and her green eyes that had seen too much. "What other people believe ain't none of my concern. Only thing that matters is what I know to be true." "And what do you know to be true, Silas Cade?" He turned to look at her then. Really look. Past the modest dress and the proper manner and the quiet voice. "I know you ain't who you say you are. I know you're running from something bad enough to make you marry a stranger and travel 1,000 miles to hide." Ruth's face went pale, but she did not deny it. "I also know you haven't hurt anyone since you've been here. You've worked harder than any woman I've ever seen. You've been kind to old Tom, and gentle with the horses and patient with me even when I've been a damn fool." He turned back to the road, guiding the wagon around a deep rut. "So no, Ruth. What other people believe don't bother me none, because I've seen who you are, and that's enough." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken words. Then Ruth's hand found his on the wagon seat. Her fingers were warm despite the chill in the air, and they squeezed once before withdrawing. "Thank you." That night, for the first time since her arrival, Silas slept in the bed beside his wife. They did not touch, did not speak, just lay in the darkness, two strangers learning to trust each other one small step at a time. But when Ruth cried out in her sleep, trapped in some nightmare she would not name, Silas reached across the space between them and took her hand. She gripped it like a lifeline. And when morning came, neither of them mentioned it. But something had changed. A wall had cracked. A bridge had been built. They were not lovers, not yet. But they were no longer quite strangers either. They were partners. Allies in a world that wanted to tear them both apart. And somewhere in the distance, Deputy Marshal Marcus Cole watched the Cade Ranch through his spyglass and made another entry in his journal. Subject has integrated into the community. Husband appears unaware of true identity. Continue surveillance. Await additional evidence before moving. He closed the journal and tucked it away. Patience, he reminded himself. Justice would come. But it would come on his terms, in his time. And when it did, Ruth Red Hawk McAllister would finally pay for what she had done. 2 weeks had passed since Ruth arrived in Cimarron, and the mask she wore was becoming a second skin. She woke before dawn each morning, slipping out of bed without disturbing Silas, who had taken to sleeping beside her with the careful distance of a man who did not want to presume. She cooked breakfast while the stars faded from the sky. She cleaned the cabin until every surface gleamed. She mended clothes and organized supplies and did everything a proper ranch wife was supposed to do. But the old instincts never truly slept. When a rattlesnake appeared near the well, she killed it with a hoe before her conscious mind even registered the threat. One precise strike severing the head from the body with the efficiency of someone who had killed before. Silas watched from the porch, his face unreadable. "You've done that before." It was not a question, but Ruth answered anyway. "Snakes were common where I grew up. You learn to deal with them, or you don't survive." He nodded slowly, accepting the explanation without truly believing it. That was something she had come to appreciate about Silas Cade. He saw through her lies, but he didn't push, didn't demand the truth before she was ready to give it. Some mornings, she caught old Tom watching her with those ancient eyes that seemed to see everything. The way she handled the horses with an expertise no Missouri farm wife should possess. The way she read weather signs like someone who had spent years living outdoors. The way she moved through the world with the constant vigilance of prey that had learned to think like a predator. He never said anything, but he started leaving small gifts for her. A better skinning knife, a warmer blanket, a pair of leather gloves that fit her hands perfectly. Grudging respect, she realized. The old vaquero had seen enough of life to recognize a survivor when he met one, and he approved. The real trouble came at the end of the second week. Silas had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Ruth alone at the ranch with old Tom. She was hanging laundry on the line when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the south road. 3 riders, moving fast, coming straight for the ranch. Old Tom appeared beside her, moving with a speed that belied his years. He pressed a rifle into her hands. "Inside, Senora. Now!" Ruth did not argue. She grabbed the rifle and ducked through the cabin door, positioning herself by the window where she could see the approaching riders without being seen. They were Blackwood's men. She recognized them from the church social, hard-faced cowboys with cruel eyes, and the swagger of men who knew they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. They reined up in the yard, and the leader, a big man with a scar across his nose, called out in a voice that dripped with contempt. "Old man, where's your boss? Silas ain't here." Old Tom stood on the porch, his hands empty and visible. He did not look afraid. "Won't be back until evening." The leader grinned, showing yellow teeth. "Good. That'll give us time to have a little chat. The judge sent us to discuss water rights. The Cades got their own well. Don't need no water rights. For now." The leader dismounted, his companions following suit. "But the judge is thinking maybe things ought to change. Maybe everyone in the valley ought to pay their fair share for access to the creek." Through the window, Ruth watched the exchange with growing cold anger. This was extortion, plain and simple. Blackwood controlled the main water source, and he was using that control to squeeze the smaller ranchers until they broke. She had seen men like him before, had worked for men like him in her darker days. Men who used power like a weapon, crushing anyone who stood in their way. "Tell your boss the Cades ain't interested." Old Tom's voice was calm, but Ruth could see the tension in his shoulders. The readiness for violence that years on the frontier had bred into his bones. "Now get off this land before I get unfriendly." The leader laughed. "Unfriendly? Old man, you ain't got enough years left to be unfriendly with us." He took a step toward the porch. "Now why don't you go inside and bring out that pretty new wife of Cade's? The boys and I would like to welcome her proper to the neighborhood." Something inside Ruth snapped. She had spent 2 weeks being quiet, 2 weeks being modest, 2 weeks pretending to be something she wasn't. But there were some things she would not tolerate, some lines she would not allow to be crossed. She stepped through the cabin door with the rifle raised to her shoulder. That's far enough. The 3 men froze. The leader's grin faded as he took in the sight of her, the steady hands, The cold eyes, the absolute stillness of a woman who knew exactly what she was capable of. Well, well. He recovered quickly, his smile returning. The little wife has some spirit after all. Put down that rifle, sweetheart. You might hurt yourself. The only one getting hurt is you if you don't get off this property in the next 10 seconds. Big words from a little woman. He took another step toward her. Why don't you put down that gun and we'll... Ruth fired. The bullet kicked up dust an inch from his boot. The crack of the rifle echoed off the mountains, and all three men reached for their guns. Next one goes between your eyes. Ruth's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Try me. The leader looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across his face. He had expected a frightened farm wife, a woman who would cower and beg. Instead, he was facing someone who held a rifle like she'd been born with one in her hands. Someone whose eyes held the cold promise of death. This ain't over. He backed toward his horse, hands raised. The judge will hear about this. Good. Ruth kept the rifle trained on him as he mounted. You tell your judge that Mrs. Cade sends her regards, and the next man he sends to threaten this ranch won't ride back at all. The riders wheeled their horses and galloped away, their threats fading into the distance. Old Tom let out a long breath. Senora. That was not the way a Missouri farm wife shoots. Ruth lowered the rifle, her hands beginning to shake as the adrenaline faded. I know. She looked at him, expecting judgment, expecting fear, expecting the same suspicion that lurked behind everyone's eyes in this town. Instead, she found something that looked almost like admiration. I won't ask questions, Senora. The old vaquero's voice was soft. But I think maybe the jefe got more than he bargained for when he sent for you. Ruth let out a laugh that was half sob. Maybe we both got more than we bargained for. Old Tom nodded slowly. Then he reached out and took the rifle from her trembling hands. Come. I'll make coffee. And then perhaps you tell me about those calluses on your palms, the ones that come from holding reins, not from needlework. Ruth stared at him. You noticed? I notice everything, Senora. It is how I've stayed alive for 65 years in a land that wants to kill everyone in it. They walked into the cabin together, and for the first time since arriving in Cimarron, Ruth allowed herself to relax. Just a little. Just enough. She had found an ally. Or perhaps an ally had found her. Either way, she was no longer quite so alone. Silas returned that evening to find his wife and his hired hand sitting on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunset in companionable silence. Something happened. Something... Ruth looked at him with those green eyes that saw too much. We had visitors. Judge Blackwood's men. They came to discuss water rights. Silas's face darkened. What did they want? To intimidate us? She paused. I discouraged them. Old Tom snorted. She shot the ground at their feet and promised to put the next bullet between the leader's eyes. The jefe's quiet wife has hidden depths. Silas looked at Ruth for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. I reckon she does at that. He sat down on the porch step beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. I've been hearing things in town. Blackwood's been buying up land all over the valley. Settlers selling out for pennies on the dollar, then moving on. 3 families just this month. He's controlling the water. Ruth kept her voice neutral, but her mind was racing. Anyone who doesn't play along finds their wells poisoned or their cattle driven off. Eventually, they have no choice but to sell. You've seen this before. It was not a question. Ruth nodded slowly. Men like Blackwood exist everywhere. They just wear different faces. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, what do we do about it? Ruth turned to look at him, surprised. We? You're my wife. This is your home, too. Whatever we decide together. She felt something shift in her chest, something warm and unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously like hope. The settlers need to organize, pool their resources, stand together against Blackwood instead of letting him pick them off one by one. That's dangerous talk. I know. They looked at each other in the fading light, two people with secrets and scars and pasts they were not ready to share. Two people who had somehow found each other in the middle of nowhere and were now facing a threat that could destroy them both. "There's a meeting tomorrow night," Silas said finally, "at Clara's saloon. The settlers who are left trying to figure out what to do. I wasn't going to go, didn't want to get involved, and now I've got something worth fighting for." He did not elaborate, did not need to. Ruth understood. The meeting at Clara's saloon was crowded and tense. Nearly 20 people had gathered in the back room, their faces drawn with worry and fear. Ruth recognized some of them from church. The Hendersons, the Pattersons, the young family from the farm east of town, with their 3 small children and their desperate eyes. Clara and Wen, the saloon's owner, moved through the crowd with practiced ease, pouring whiskey and keeping the peace. She was a striking woman in her 40s, mixed heritage giving her features an exotic beauty that must have been stunning in her youth. Her eyes were sharp and knowing, and when they landed on Ruth, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, one survivor seeing another. "This is pointless." Jeb Henderson slammed his glass on the table. "Blackwood owns the law in this territory. We fight him, we lose. Plain and simple, so we just give up?" His wife, Mary, glared at him. "Sell everything we've built and walk away with nothing? What choice do we have?" Jeb's voice cracked. "You've seen what happens to people who stand against the judge. The Millers, the Cranstons, gone without a trace." Ruth listened from her place in the corner, cataloging faces and reactions. Silas stood beside her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "We could go to the territorial marshal." Young Will Patterson spoke up, his voice uncertain. "File complaints. Make them investigate." Clara snorted. "The marshal's office is in Santa Fe. 3 weeks' ride there and back." "And who do you think funded the last marshal's campaign?" She shook her head. "Blackwood's got friends in high places, friends who owe him favors. Then we're dead no matter what we do." Jeb reached for the whiskey bottle. "Might as well enjoy what time we've got left. Or we could fight." Everyone turned to look at Silas. He had not spoken all night, content to listen and observe, but now he stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "Blackwood's powerful, but he's not invincible. He's only got about 30 men. We've got that many settlers in this room alone, plus our hands and our families. We outnumber him. His men are professional killers." Jeb shook his head. "We're farmers and shopkeepers. Some of us are more than that." Silas did not look at Ruth, but she felt his words like a physical touch. "We don't have to win a war. We just have to make it too expensive for him to continue. Make him understand that every piece of land he steals will cost him blood. Eventually, even a man like Blackwood has to count the cost." The room was silent. Ruth could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else, something that looked like hope. "You're talking about getting killed," Jeb said finally. "Getting our families killed. I'm talking about not lying down to die without a fight." Silas stepped closer to the table, placing his hands flat on the worn wood. "I came to this valley 5 years ago looking for peace. Figured I'd earned it after everything I'd been through. Figured if I just kept my head down and minded my own business, trouble would pass me by." He shook his head. "Trouble doesn't pass anyone by. Not when men like Blackwood are running things. Sooner or later he comes for everyone. The only question is whether we're going to face him together or die alone." Ruth watched her husband with new eyes. This was not the quiet, withdrawn man she had married. This was someone else, someone with fire in his voice and steel in his spine. Someone, she realized, who had been waiting for a reason to fight. The silence stretched. Then Clara spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "He's right. I've been gathering information for months. Blackwood's planning something big. Something to do with the railroad coming through. He wants to own the whole valley before they break ground." She pulled a map from beneath the bar and spread it on the table. But he's made enemies, powerful enemies, men who have their own plans for this territory. If we can find proof of what he's done, real proof, we might be able to bring him down through the courts. And if we can't, Jeb asked, then we do it the old-fashioned way. Clara's smile was sharp as a razor, with guns and rope and a reckoning long overdue. The meeting went late into the night. Plans were made, alliances formed. By the time Ruth and Silas rode home under the stars, something had shifted in the valley. The settlers were not just victims anymore, they were fighters. And leading them, quietly but surely, were a former Texas Ranger who had killed his own brother and a notorious female outlaw pretending to be a quiet wife. God help anyone who stood in their way. Deputy Marshal Marcus Cole arrived in Cimarron on a Tuesday morning, riding a gray gelding that looked as tired as he felt. 18 months. 18 months he had been tracking Ruth Red Hawk McAllister across 3 territories, following whispers and rumors, and the fading trail of a woman who seemed to vanish like smoke whenever he got close. But he had found her at last. The telegram from his contact in Missouri had been brief but certain. Subject spotted boarding westbound train in St. Joseph, traveling under name Ruth McAllister. Destination Cimarron, New Mexico territory. Answering mail order bride advertisement. Cole had laughed when he read it. The most notorious female outlaw in the territories, the woman whose name made strong men nervous, pretending to be a demure widow seeking a fresh start. It was almost clever. Almost. But not clever enough to fool Marcus Cole. He had taken his time getting here. No sense in spooking her before he had his ducks in a row. He needed evidence, witnesses, something that would hold up in court and guarantee she would hang, because this was not just about justice. This was personal. Frank McAllister had been Cole's cousin. His only family left after his parents died of fever when he was 12. Frank had been wild, sure. Had a streak of mean in him that made sensible folks nervous. But he was blood. And Ruth had let them hang him. She had been his wife, for God's sake. His partner. The one person in the world who should have found a way to save him. Instead, she had disappeared into the night, leaving Frank to face the gallows alone. The territorial court had called it justice. Cole called it betrayal. Now, 18 months later, he was going to make her pay. He spent his first week in Cimarron being careful, asking questions that seemed innocent, visiting the church, the general store, the saloon, listening to gossip and watching the new Mrs. Cade from a distance. She was good, he had to admit. The disguise was nearly perfect. The modest dress, the downcast eyes, the quiet voice. Anyone who didn't know better would swear she was exactly what she claimed to be. But Cole knew better. He had seen her wanted poster 100 times, had memorized every detail of her description. The green eyes, the dark hair, the small scar below her left ear, courtesy of Frank's temper during one of their arguments. The scar was still there, faint, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. But there. That was all the proof he needed. On his 8th day in town, he decided it was time to make his move. The Cade Ranch spread across a gentle hill north of town, modest but well-maintained. Cole rode up the approach road with his badge gleaming in the morning sun, making no attempt at stealth. He wanted her to see him coming, wanted her to know that the hunt was over. A woman appeared on the porch as he approached. She was prettier than he had expected, with delicate features and those unforgettable green eyes. She wore a simple calico dress and held a dish rag in her hands, the picture of domestic innocence. But Cole saw the way her eyes went to his badge, saw the nearly imperceptible tension that tightened her shoulders, saw the slight shift in her stance, as if she were calculating the distance to the nearest weapon. "Gotcha. Good morning, ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat, keeping his voice friendly. "Deputy Marshal Marcus Cole. Just introducing myself to the new residents of the valley." Ruth smiled, and it was almost convincing. "Good morning, Deputy. I'm Mrs. Cade. My husband is in the barn. Shall I fetch him?" "That won't be necessary." Cole dismounted, his eyes never leaving her face. I was hoping to speak with you, actually. Just routine questions for new arrivals. Of course, please come in. I just made coffee. She led him into the cabin, and Cole took careful note of everything. The rifle on the wall, the layout of the rooms, the back door that led to the rear of the property, the small window over the sink that was large enough for a slender woman to climb through. She was cataloging too, he realized. Watching him, watch her. Both of them playing a game, each trying to gain the upper hand. You're from Missouri, I understand. Cole accepted the cup of coffee she offered, wrapping his hands around the warmth. St. Joseph, wasn't it? That's right. Ruth sat across from him, her posture perfect, her face serene. My late husband had a dry goods store there. St. Joseph. Lots of interesting people pass through there. Gateway to the frontier. Yes, I suppose it is. Cole leaned forward, his voice casual. I spent some time in St. Joseph myself, a few years back, tracking a fugitive. Woman named McAllister. Ruth McAllister, matter of fact. Same name as you. He watched her carefully for a reaction. A flinch? A tell? Anything that would confirm what he already knew. But Ruth's expression never changed. If anything, she seemed amused. McAllister is a common name, Deputy, particularly among the Scots-Irish settlers in Missouri. I'm sure there are dozens of Ruth McAllisters in the territories. I'm sure there are. Cole set down his coffee cup. But there's only one Red Hawk. The name hung in the air between them like a drawn gun. Ruth tilted her head, her green eyes unreadable. Red Hawk? I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you? Cole's voice hardened. Ruth Red Hawk McAllister, member of the Dalton Gang. Wanted in Kansas territory for robbery, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. There's a $500 bounty on her head. That sounds like quite a dangerous woman. Ruth took a sip of her coffee, completely at ease. I hope you catch her, Deputy. I intend to. The cabin door opened and Silas Cade stepped through. He took in the scene with a single glance, the lawman seated across from his wife, the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Deputy Cole. Silas's voice was carefully neutral. Didn't expect to see you here. Just paying a social call, Mr. Cade, getting to know the new folks in town. Cole rose, setting his hat on his head. I'll be on my way. But I expect I'll be seeing you both again. Soon. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. Oh, one more thing. He turned back to Ruth, his smile cold. Frank McAllister was my cousin. Did I mention that? His wife disappeared the night before his hanging. Left him to die alone. He let the words sink in. I've spent 18 months tracking that woman, and I don't intend to stop until I see her swing from the same gallows. He walked out into the sunlight, leaving silence in his wake. After he was gone, Ruth and Silas stood in the cabin's small kitchen, neither speaking. Finally, Silas broke the silence. He knows. He suspects. Ruth's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. It's not the same thing. It will be. Soon. Ruth looked at him then, really looked, searching his face for judgment or condemnation. She found neither. Only a quiet determination that matched her own. What do you want to do? He asked. It was such a simple question. What do you want to do? Not what are you going to do, as if her fate were already decided. Not what should I do, as if he had the right to dictate her choices. What do you want to do? As if her wants mattered, as if her desires had weight. Ruth felt something crack inside her, a wall she had built over years of running, years of hiding, years of pretending to be someone she wasn't. I'm tired, Silas. The words came out in a whisper, torn from somewhere deep inside her. I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of waking up every morning wondering if today is the day someone finally catches up with me. She looked out the window at the valley spread below them, beautiful and wild and free. I came here looking for a fresh start, a chance to be someone new. But Cole's right. Frank was my husband, even if I never loved him, even if he was a monster who used to beat me when I refused to go along with his schemes. Her voice broke. I was 16 when Frank found me. My parents had just died of cholera, and I had nothing, no family, no money, no prospects. He offered me food and shelter and protection. I thought he was saving me. Silas said nothing, just listened. I didn't know what he really was until it was too late. By then, I was in too deep. I held horses during robberies. I kept watch while men did terrible things. I never killed anyone, but I didn't stop them either. I was complicit. She turned to face him. When Frank got caught, I should have stayed. Should have testified against him. Should have faced justice alongside him. Instead, I ran. I've been running ever since. And now? Now. Ruth took a deep breath. Now I think maybe it's time to stop. Silas crossed the small cabin and took her hands in his. His palms were rough with calluses, warm and steady. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. You understand? You're not alone anymore. Ruth looked into his eyes and saw no judgment there, no fear, only acceptance, only love, perhaps. She squeezed his hands and felt something shift inside her, something that had been broken for a very long time beginning slowly to heal. Then let's figure out what we're going to do about Deputy Cole. That night, around Clara's back table, they laid out the situation. Cole was patient, Clara said. She had been gathering information, as she always did, but he was also persistent. Sooner or later, he would find the evidence he needed. Can't you just leave? Clara asked. Disappear again? Ruth shook her head. Running won't solve anything. Cole will just keep following. And besides, she glanced at Silas, I'm tired of running. What about the courts? Old Tom spoke for the first time. The Senora says she never killed anyone. If she testifies, maybe Cole doesn't want justice. Ruth's voice was flat. He wants revenge. His cousin died, and he needs someone to blame. Even if I'm acquitted, he won't stop. Silence fell over the table. Then Silas spoke. What if we give him something bigger to chase? What do you mean? Blackwood. Silas leaned forward, his eyes intent. He's the real criminal here, stealing land, burning out settlers. Probably responsible for half a dozen deaths if we could prove it. If we could give Cole evidence against Blackwood, he'd have to investigate. Clara's eyes widened. He's a deputy marshal. He can't ignore evidence of crimes that big. And if he's busy investigating Blackwood, he can't spend all his time hunting me. Ruth felt hope kindle in her chest. It's not a solution, but it might buy us time. More than that, Clara's smile was sharp. Blackwood's got connections to Frank McAllister. I've heard rumors. If we can prove Blackwood was the one giving orders to the Dalton gang, then Cole's revenge would point at a new target. Ruth sat back, her mind racing. Blackwood created Red Hawk. He's the reason I became what I became. If Cole knew that we need proof. Silas's voice was firm. Real proof. Something that will hold up in a territorial court. I might know where to find it. Clara pulled a piece of paper from her bodice and spread it on the table. Blackwood keeps records. He's too smart not to. Payments. Agreements. Everything that could be used as leverage. He keeps them in his study, in a safe. And you know this how? Clara smiled. I know many things, Mr. Cade. It's my business to know things. Ruth studied the paper. A rough map of Blackwood's ranch with the study marked on the second floor. Getting in there won't be easy. No. Clara's smile widened. But I happen to know that Blackwood is hosting a party next Saturday. All the important people in the territory will be there. Including the Cades? Including the Cades. If they're willing to take the risk. Ruth looked at Silas. He looked back at her. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. We're in, Ruth said. And so the plan began to take shape. The wanted poster appeared 3 days before Blackwood's party. Ruth saw it while buying supplies at Patterson's general store, pinned to the notice board alongside advertisements for livestock sales and announcements for church socials. Wanted for robbery and murder. Ruth Red Hawk McAllister. $500 reward. The sketch didn't look exactly like her. The artist had drawn her with short hair, men's clothing, and an expression of hard cruelty that made her look more monster than woman. But the description was accurate enough to make her blood run cold. Green eyes, dark hair, scar below left ear, skilled horsewoman, armed and extremely dangerous. Clara appeared beside her, moving with the silent grace of a woman who had learned to pass unnoticed. "Don't look at it." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't react. Walk normal. We'll talk at my place." Ruth forced herself to turn away from the poster, her heart hammering against her ribs. She paid for her supplies with hands that trembled only slightly, then followed Clara out the back door of the general store and through the alley to the saloon. Inside Clara's private quarters, Ruth finally let herself breathe. "Cole's work," Clara said. She poured them both whiskey, not bothering with glasses. "Straight from the bottle. He's trying to flush you out, make you panic, make you run. It's working." Ruth took a long drink, feeling the liquor burn its way down her throat. How long before someone puts it together? The poster's been there all morning. Half the town's probably seen it by now. The sketch doesn't look like you. Not really. And you've been playing the proper wife so well that no one would believe Ruth laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't know small towns, Clara. People believe what they want to believe. And right now they want to believe that the quiet stranger who married Silas Cade is exactly what she claims to be. But if someone plants a seed of doubt..." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her desk and pulled out a leather folder. "I've been doing some digging, asking questions through channels you don't want to know about." She handed Ruth the folder. "I found something you need to see." Ruth opened the folder. Inside was a single page, yellowed with age, covered in careful handwriting. "What is this?" "A letter." Clara's voice was grim. "Written by your father to Judge Blackwood, 6 years ago." Ruth's hands trembled as she read. "Dear Judge Blackwood, I am writing to beg your mercy. The debt I owe has grown beyond my ability to repay. The cholera has taken my wife and left me caring for our daughter alone. I cannot work, cannot earn, cannot provide. I am asking you to extend my deadline by 6 months. Just 6 months, and I will find a way to make good on what I owe. Please, sir, for the sake of my daughter, if not for me." The letter ended there. No signature, no closing. Just the desperate plea of a dying man. Ruth looked up at Clara, her vision blurring with tears she had not allowed herself to shed in years. "I don't understand. There's more." Clara pulled another document from her files. "This is a record of a payment made by Blackwood to Frank McAllister, dated 3 weeks after your father died. The notation says information regarding the Holloway girl." Ruth felt the room spin around her. "Blackwood. He's the one who told Frank where to find me. He didn't just profit from what happened to you." Clara's voice was soft with sympathy. "He arranged it. Sold you like livestock to settle a debt your father couldn't pay." Ruth stared at the documents in her hands. 6 years ago, she had been a frightened 16-year-old orphan, alone in the world, desperate for anyone who would help her survive. Frank McAllister had appeared like an answer to prayer, offering food and shelter and protection. She had thought it was chance, fate, luck. Instead, it had been business. Blackwood had sold her, and she had never known. She felt something cold and hard settle into her chest, something that had been soft and wounded for so long finally crystallizing into diamond. "Does Cole know about this?" "I don't think so." Clara shook her head. "He's been focused on you, not on who was pulling the strings. But if we can show him, then he has a new target for his revenge." Ruth's voice was flat. "Blackwood didn't just create Red Hawk. He created the circumstances that got Frank killed. If Cole wants someone to blame for his cousin's death, Blackwood's a much better candidate than me. That's a dangerous game, Ruth." I know. Ruth carefully folded the documents and tucked them into her bodice. But I'm tired of being the prey. It's time to become the hunter. She left Clara's saloon with a new purpose burning in her chest. For 6 years, she had blamed herself for everything that had happened. For joining the gang, for staying with Frank, for all the terrible things she had witnessed and failed to stop. Now she knew the truth. She had never had a choice. From the moment her father died, owing money to Judge Blackwood, her fate had been sealed. She had been sold like cattle to a man who would use her until she was used up, then discard her without a second thought. Blackwood had done this to her, and Blackwood was going to pay. That evening, she told Silas everything. They sat on the porch as the sun went down, watching the valley turn gold and crimson. Ruth spoke in a low, steady voice, recounting the story she had pieced together from Clara's documents. When she finished, Silas was quiet for a long time. "Your father owed Blackwood money," he finally said. "And when he couldn't pay, Blackwood sold information about you to Frank McAllister." "Yes." "Who recruited you into his gang." "Yes." "And you were 16, orphaned, alone, with no one to protect you." "Yes." Silas turned to look at her, and the rage in his eyes was like nothing she had ever seen. "Blackwood's been sitting in that mansion for 6 years, playing respectable citizen, while you've been running for your life, running from something he caused." "I know. And Cole's been hunting you instead of him." "I know." Silas stood abruptly, pacing the length of the porch. "This changes everything. We're not just looking for evidence against Blackwood anymore. We're looking for the connection between him and Frank McAllister. If we can prove that Blackwood was behind the gang's activities, then Cole can't ignore it." Ruth stood too, catching Silas's hands in hers. "He's a lawman. Whatever his personal feelings, he took an oath. If we give him proof that Blackwood ordered the crimes Frank was hanged for, then Blackwood swings instead of you." Silas pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "We'll find it. Whatever it takes. We'll find the proof and we'll burn Blackwood to the ground." Ruth leaned into him, feeling his strength surrounding her. For the first time in 6 years, she was not alone. For the first time in 6 years, she had hope. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Clara provided information about Blackwood's ranch, the layout of the house, the location of the study, the number of guards and their patrol routes. Old Tom contributed knowledge of the terrain, the approach roads, the places where riders could be seen and the places where they could hide. Silas and Ruth planned and practiced and argued about details until they were both exhausted. And through it all, Cole watched. He did not approach them again, did not make any overt moves, just watched from a distance, his gray gelding a constant presence on the edges of their awareness. "He's waiting," Ruth said one evening, "waiting for me to make a mistake. Then we'd better not make any mistakes." They did not speak of what would happen if the plan failed, did not discuss the possibility that Blackwood might be too powerful to bring down, did not acknowledge the fear that lurked beneath their determination. They just kept planning. And finally, the night of the party arrived. Ruth dressed carefully in the borrowed gown Clara had provided. Deep blue silk, elegant but modest, nothing that would draw undue attention. Her hair was pinned up in the style of a proper lady, and she had practiced walking in the unfamiliar shoes until she could move without stumbling. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. "You're beautiful." She turned to find Silas watching her from the doorway. He was dressed in his Sunday suit, looking uncomfortable but determined. "You clean up pretty well yourself." He crossed the room and took her hands. "You don't have to do this. We could find another way. If something goes wrong, then we deal with it, together." Ruth squeezed his hands. "I'm done running, Silas. Whatever happens tonight, I'm done hiding from who I am and what was done to me." He kissed her then, soft and slow and full of everything he could not say. When they pulled apart, his eyes were bright with emotion. "Let's go burn down an empire." Ruth smiled. "Let's." Blackwood's ranch blazed with light as Silas and Ruth arrived. Lanterns hung from every tree. Music drifted from the windows. Carriages lined the long drive, and people in their finest clothes mingled on the lawn. It looked like a celebration. It felt like walking into the lion's den. Remember the plan. Silas helped Ruth down from the wagon, his hand lingering on hers. We have 2 hours before old Tom starts the distraction. Get in, get the evidence, get out. And if something goes wrong, then we improvise. They walked up the drive together, arm in arm, playing the part of a humble ranching couple overwhelmed by their invitation to such a grand affair. Blackwood met them at the door. Mr. and Mrs. Cade. His smile was warm, his handshake firm, his eyes cold as a snake's. So glad you could join us. I was beginning to think you might not come. We wouldn't miss it, Judge. Silas kept his voice humble. It's an honor to be invited. The honor is mine. Blackwood's gaze slid to Ruth, and something flickered in their depths. You look lovely tonight, Mrs. Cade. That dress suits you. Thank you, sir. Ruth dropped her eyes demurely, even as her skin crawled. You're very kind. Please, make yourselves at home. There's food and drink aplenty, and do try the punch. It's my own special recipe. He drifted away to greet other guests, and Ruth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He knows, she whispered. I could see it in his eyes. He suspects. Silas guided her toward the refreshment table. That's not the same thing. Just stay calm and stick to the plan. The next 2 hours were an exercise in patience. Ruth smiled and nodded and made small talk with the other guests while her mind raced with calculations. The guards changed shifts every 45 minutes. The study was on the second floor, third door on the right. The safe was behind a portrait of Blackwood's late mother. She had memorized every detail Clara had provided. Now she just had to wait for the right moment. Finally, just as the clock struck 10, a commotion arose outside. Fire in the stables, someone shouted. Everyone outside. The party dissolved into chaos. Guests streamed toward the doors, some panicking, others trying to organize buckets and blankets. Through the confusion, Ruth caught Silas's eye. He nodded once, then moved to position himself at the foot of the stairs. Ruth slipped through the crowd, moving against the flow of bodies, and climbed the stairs without looking back. The second floor was empty. Everyone had rushed outside to deal with the fire. Old Tom's distraction was working perfectly. She moved quickly down the hallway, counting doors. First door, second door, third door on the right. The study. Ruth tried the handle. Locked. She pulled a pair of picks from her bodice and went to work. The lock was good, but she had been opening locks since she was 17. 90 seconds later, the door swung open. Inside, the study was exactly as Clara had described. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, a massive desk covered in papers, and on the wall behind it, a portrait of a stern-faced woman who could only be Blackwood's mother. Ruth moved to the portrait and lifted it from its hook. The safe was right where it should be. She pressed her ear to the cold metal and began to work the combination. Click, click, click. The safe swung open. Inside, she found exactly what she was looking for. And more. Land deeds, dozens of them, acquired from settlers at prices far below value. Payment ledgers. Regular sums to unnamed contractors on dates that matched known outlaw raids. Letters. Correspondence with railroad officials confirming the planned route through Cimarron. And at the bottom, in a leather folder, the proof she needed. A daguerreotype of her mother as a young woman, and a letter. Regarding your inquiry about the Holloway girl. She was married to Daniel Holloway, who died of cholera, along with his wife in '81. The daughter, Ruth, age 16, was taken in by associates. Current whereabouts unknown. The debt her father owed is considered settled by his death, per our agreement. Signed Horatio Blackwood, 1881. Ruth's hands shook as she stared at the letter. Here was proof, undeniable proof, that Blackwood had sold her to Frank McAllister, that everything she had suffered for 6 years was because of him. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Moving fast, she stuffed the most damning documents into her bodice and closed the safe. Replaced the portrait. Turned toward the window. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Cade?" Blackwood stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. Ruth froze. "I knew you were trouble from the moment you stepped off that train." Blackwood's voice was conversational, almost friendly. "Those eyes. I never forget a pair of eyes like that. Took me a while to place them, but then I remembered. You looked just like your mother." Ruth said nothing. Her mind raced, calculating distances, exits, possibilities. "I wondered what happened to Daniel Holloway's daughter." Blackwood stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Sold her to Frank McAllister for pennies on the dollar. Never thought I'd see her again." "Why?" Ruth's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Why did you do it?" "Business, my dear. Your father owed me money. When he died, I had to recoup my losses somehow. Frank was always looking for fresh talent. It seemed like a fair exchange." Ruth felt rage building in her chest. "You sold me. I was 16 years old, and you sold me like cattle. I did what was necessary." Blackwood shrugged. "The frontier is harsh. Only the strong survive. Your father was weak. You apparently are stronger than I gave you credit for." He raised the pistol. "Unfortunately, that strength has become inconvenient. I can't have you running around with documents that could damage my reputation." Ruth tensed, preparing to dodge. The window behind her exploded inward. Silas came through in a shower of glass, tackling Blackwood before he could fire. The pistol went off, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling as the two men crashed to the floor. "Go!" Silas shouted. "Get the evidence out of here!" Ruth didn't hesitate. She grabbed the window frame and swung herself out onto the roof, then slid down the trellis to the garden below. Old Tom was waiting with the horses. "Senora!" He tossed her Rosalind's reins. "We must go! The guards are coming!" Ruth swung into the saddle. "What about Silas?" "The Jefe can take care of himself. We must get you and those papers to safety." Ruth wanted to argue, wanted to go back for her husband. But she knew he was right. The evidence in her bodice was more important than any one person, even the person she was beginning to realize she loved. She kicked Rosalind into a gallop and raced into the darkness, leaving the burning ranch behind. Silas caught up with them an hour later. He was battered and bleeding, his Sunday suit torn, his knuckles raw. But he was alive. Ruth threw herself into his arms the moment he dismounted. "I thought I lost you. Takes more than a corrupt judge to put me down." Silas held her tight, his breath warm against her hair. "Did you get it?" "Everything." Ruth pulled back to look at him. "The land deeds, the payment records, and proof that Blackwood sold me to Frank McAllister. Everything we need to bury him." Silas grinned through his bruises. "Then let's find Deputy Cole." They found him at the saloon, nursing a whiskey and looking like a man who had reached the end of his rope. "Deputy." Silas dropped into the chair across from him. "We have something you need to see." Cole looked up, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "I'm not interested in whatever lies you're trying to... This isn't about Ruth." Silas spread the documents on the table. "This is about Judge Blackwood, and what really happened to your cousin." Cole went very still. Ruth pulled the letter from her bodice and laid it before him. "6 years ago, my father owed Blackwood money. When he died, Blackwood sold information about me to Frank McAllister. Told him where to find a desperate 16-year-old orphan who could be easily recruited." She met Cole's eyes. "I never chose to join Frank's gang. I was sold into it. By the same man who gave Frank his orders. The same man who is responsible for everything your cousin did, everything your cousin died for." Cole read the letter in silence. Then he read it again. When he finally looked up, his face was ashen. Blackwood was behind the Dalton gang. He funded them, directed them, used them to drive settlers off their land so he could buy it cheap. Ruth pushed the payment ledgers across the table. "It's all here. Every raid, every robbery, every murder. Frank was just a tool. Blackwood was the one pulling the strings." Cole stared at the documents. His hands trembled. All this time, he whispered. All this time I've been hunting you. And the real criminal was sitting in a mansion, laughing at us all. Ruth said nothing. There was nothing to say. Cole picked up his badge and studied it for a long moment. Then he set it carefully on the table. I became a lawman to bring justice to the people who killed my family. He looked at Ruth, and for the first time she saw the grief beneath his anger. I thought that meant you. I was wrong. He stood, squaring his shoulders. Judge Blackwood is a territorial official. That means he falls under the jurisdiction of the marshal's office in Santa Fe. I'll wire them tonight. By morning, we'll have authorization to make an arrest. Ruth felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. What about my warrant? Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, the warrant was based on testimony that you participated willingly in Frank's crimes. If Blackwood coerced you into joining the gang, that testimony is invalid. I'll recommend the territorial court review your case with this new evidence. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't freedom, but it was a chance, more than she had dared to hope for. Thank you. Cole nodded once, then walked out of the saloon without looking back. Ruth turned to Silas, tears streaming down her face. Is it really over? He pulled her close. Not yet, but it's the beginning of the end. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A new day was coming, and with it the promise of justice. Word of Blackwood's crimes spread through Cimarron like wildfire. Within 3 days, the territorial marshal's office had dispatched a team of deputies to investigate. Within a week, they had seized Blackwood's records and taken statements from dozens of settlers who had been forced off their land. The evidence was overwhelming. Blackwood fought back, of course. He had money. He had connections. He had lawyers who promised to tie up the case in court for years. But the tide had turned against him. Settlers who had been too afraid to speak began coming forward. Clara's network of informants produced documents that Blackwood had thought destroyed. Even some of his own men, seeing which way the wind was blowing, started talking. The judge was going down, and he knew it. Ruth watched the proceedings from a distance, not wanting to draw attention to herself. Her own legal situation remained unresolved. Cole had recommended clemency, but the territorial court moved slowly, and there were still those who remembered the name Red Hawk with fear and hatred. She tried to be patient, tried to trust that justice would prevail. It wasn't easy. One evening, 2 weeks after the party, she sat on the porch with Silas, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of crimson and gold. Cole came by today. Silas's voice was carefully neutral. The court has set a date for your hearing, 3 weeks from now in Santa Fe. Ruth felt her stomach tighten. And he thinks they'll reduce the charges. Silas took her hand. You were a victim, Ruth. The evidence proves it. Even the prosecutors can see that. But will that be enough? Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, I don't know. But whatever happens, I'll be there. We'll face it together. Ruth leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. I'm scared, she admitted. The first time she had said those words aloud in years. I've spent so long running, so long hiding. What if they don't believe me? What if... Then we'll fight. Silas pulled her close. We'll appeal. We'll hire lawyers. We'll do whatever it takes. You're not alone anymore, Ruth. You haven't been alone since the day you stepped off that train. She looked up at him, at this man who had asked for a quiet wife and gotten a wanted outlaw instead. This man who had never once judged her for her past, who had stood by her through everything. I love you, she said. The words came out before she could stop them. She hadn't meant to say them, hadn't even fully acknowledged them to herself. But there they were, hanging in the air between them like a promise. Silas went very still. Then he smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine, lighting up his weathered face. Took you long enough? He kissed her as the sun went down, and for a moment, Ruth forgot about courts and charges and the uncertain future that stretched before them. For a moment, there was only this, only him, only love. The attack came 3 nights later. Ruth woke to the sound of gunfire and the smell of smoke. Silas was already on his feet, grabbing his rifle from the wall. "Blackwood," he said. It was not a question. "Has to be." They had known this might happen, known that a man like Blackwood would not go quietly. He had too much to lose, too much pride, too much rage at being exposed. But knowing and facing were two different things. Ruth pulled on her boots and grabbed her own weapon, a shotgun Silas had given her after the incident with Blackwood's men. How many? Hard to tell. Silas peered through the window. At least a dozen, maybe more. More gunfire outside. A voice she recognized as old Tom's, shouting in Spanish. "They have surrounded the barn." The old vaquero's voice came through the darkness. "I count 15, maybe more. Can you get to the horses?" "I will try, Jefe. Be careful. I am always careful." Ruth moved to the other window, scanning the darkness for targets. There. 3 men moving toward the cabin from the east. She raised the shotgun. The first blast took out the lead man. The second scattered his companions. Nice shooting. Silas dropped to one knee beside her, lining up his own shot. "You learned that in Missouri?" Despite everything, Ruth felt herself smile. Something like that. The battle raged for what felt like hours. Blackwood's men were not professionals. They were hired guns, desperate men paid to do dirty work. But they had numbers, and they had the advantage of surprise. Ruth and Silas fought back to back, covering each other's blind spots, moving through the cabin like they had been doing this together for years. They made a good team, but good was not always enough. Reloading. Silas ducked behind the overturned table. Ruth covered him, firing at the shadows beyond the window. How many left? Can't tell. Too much smoke. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. The horses screamed in terror. "Tom!" Ruth shouted. "The horses!" A figure emerged from the inferno, leading 3 panicked horses through the flames. Old Tom, his clothes smoking, his face blackened with soot. "I got them, Senora. Rosalind is safe." Relief flooded through Ruth. But before she could respond, a new sound reached her ears. Hoofbeats, coming fast. Cole appeared out of the darkness, leading a dozen men. "Territorial marshals, put down your weapons." For a moment, everything froze. Then Blackwood's men scattered, fleeing into the night like rats from a sinking ship. Cole dismounted and strode toward the cabin, his face grim. "Is everyone all right?" "We're alive." Silas emerged from the cabin, rifle still in hand. "Thanks to you. Thank the telegraph." Cole holstered his pistol. "We got word Blackwood was planning something. Rode all night to get here." Ruth stepped out onto the porch, shotgun lowered but not set aside. "Is it over?" Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "We found Blackwood at his ranch, trying to burn his records before we could seize them. He resisted arrest." "Is he dead?" Cole's voice was flat. "Shot by one of my men when he drew on us." Ruth waited to feel something. Relief, satisfaction, triumph. Instead, she felt only emptiness. Blackwood had destroyed her life, had sold her like property, had set in motion a chain of events that had led to years of suffering and fear. And now he was gone. It should have felt like victory. It just felt like exhaustion. "It's really over," she said. "The charges against you have been dropped." Cole reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Word came through this morning. In light of the evidence proving you were coerced into joining the McAllister gang, the territorial court has dismissed all charges. The bounty on Ruth Red Hawk McAllister has been lifted." Ruth stared at the paper in his hands. "I'm free?" Cole nodded. "You're free." Ruth took the paper with trembling hands, unfolded it, read the words that she had never dared to hope she would see. Ruth McAllister, all charges dismissed, bounty rescinded. She looked up at Silas, tears streaming down her face. "I'm free," she whispered. He pulled her into his arms. "You're free." Behind them, the barn continued to burn. Around them, the marshals secured the scene and tended to the wounded. But Ruth noticed none of it. For the first time in 6 years, she was not running. For the first time in 6 years, she had a future, and it started here. The rebuilding began the next morning. Ruth stood in the yard surveying the damage. The barn was a total loss, nothing but blackened timbers and smoking ash. The cabin had taken bullet holes through every window. The corral fence was half destroyed. It looked like a battlefield, which she supposed it was. Could be worse. Silas came to stand beside her, his arm going around her shoulders. "We're alive. The horses survived. The house is still standing. It's going to take weeks to rebuild. Then we'd better get started." The settlers came to help. They arrived in wagons and on horseback, bringing lumber and tools and the kind of practical sympathy that frontier people understood. The Hendersons, the Pattersons, the young family from the East Farm. Even people Ruth had never met, people who had only heard of the Cades by reputation. "Blackwood hurt all of us," Jeb Henderson said, wielding a hammer with more enthusiasm than skill. "Time we showed him and anyone like him that we stand together." Within a week, the new barn was framed. Within 2 weeks, it was finished. It was bigger than the old one, better built. A community project that had brought the valley together in ways Blackwood never could have imagined. Ruth worked alongside everyone else, her soft hands growing calloused, her muscles growing strong. She was no longer pretending to be a proper farm wife. She was becoming one. Clara came out from town every few days, bringing supplies and gossip. The territorial court had seized all of Blackwood's assets. His land was being redistributed to the settlers he had cheated. The railroad was coming through, and everyone who had lost property was being compensated. Justice, slow and imperfect, was being served. And then there was the matter of old Tom. The old vaquero had been badly burned saving the horses. For 3 days he hovered between life and death, while Ruth sat by his bedside, refusing to leave. "You should rest, Senora." His voice was barely a whisper. "I am old. If my time has come, your time has not come." Ruth gripped his hand. "You hear me, old man? I forbid you to die." Old Tom laughed, then coughed, then laughed again. "You are very bossy for a quiet wife. I was never a quiet wife." "No." His eyes met hers, clear despite the fever. "No, you were not. But you are a good woman, Ruth Cade. Better than you know." He survived. It took weeks of careful nursing. But the old vaquero's stubborn spirit proved stronger than his injuries. By the time the new barn was finished, he was sitting up in bed, complaining about the food and demanding to see his horses. Clara visited every day during his recovery. Ruth noticed the way they looked at each other. The small smiles, the gentle touches. She said nothing, but she smiled. Spring came to the Cimarron Valley. The grass turned green, the wildflowers bloomed, the cattle grew fat on good grazing, and the settlers began to look forward to a future that had seemed impossible just months before. Ruth stood on the porch of her rebuilt home, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and felt something she had never expected to feel again. Peace. "You look happy." Silas came to stand beside her, pressing a cup of coffee into her hands. "I am happy." Ruth leaned into him. "Is that strange? After everything you've been through?" He kissed the top of her head. "No, I think you've earned it." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the valley wake up around them. "I've been thinking." Silas's voice was careful. "About the future." "Oh?" "We've got the ranch running smooth, got good people helping out. Got money coming in from the settlement Blackwood's estate paid to the settlers he cheated." Ruth turned to look at him, curious. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking maybe it's time to expand, buy some more land, build up the herd." He paused. "Maybe build a bigger house, one with room for a family." Ruth felt her heart skip. "A family?" Silas turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Ruth Cade. I sent for a quiet wife and got the wildest woman in the territories. You've turned my life upside down, made me face my past, made me fight for something worth fighting for, made me believe that maybe I deserve to be happy after all." He dropped to one knee. "I know we're already married. Know the preacher said all the words already. But I want to say them again. Say them right this time. Will you be my wife, Ruth? My partner? The mother of my children? Will you stay with me and build something together?" Ruth looked down at him, this man who had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway, this man who had risked everything to protect her, this man who had never once tried to make her into something she wasn't. "Yes," she said. And then she was in his arms, and he was kissing her, and the coffee cup was forgotten on the porch rail. "I love you." Ruth pulled back just enough to see his face. "I love you, Silas Cade. I love you too." His smile was like the sunrise. "My wild, beautiful, impossible wife." That night they lay together in their rebuilt home in the bed they had finally truly shared. "I never thought I would have this." Ruth's voice was soft in the darkness. "A home, a husband, a future. You have it now." "I know." She curled closer to him. "I just want to make sure I don't lose it." Silas pulled her close. "You won't. I promise. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Outside, the coyotes sang their wild songs to the stars. Inside, two people who had been broken found wholeness in each other. And in the distance, a new day was dawning. The wedding was held on a perfect spring morning. Not their legal wedding, the hasty affair performed by a drunk preacher months ago. This was the real wedding, the one they had chosen. Clara had transformed the ranch yard into a garden of wildflowers. Old Tom, still recovering but determined to participate, sat in a place of honor near the front. The settlers of the valley filled the benches, neighbors who had become family. Even Deputy Cole was there, standing awkwardly in the back, still uncomfortable with his changed relationship to the Cades. Ruth wore a dress of pale blue that Clara had ordered from Santa Fe. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and wildflowers were woven into the strands. She had never felt more beautiful. Silas waited for her at the makeshift altar, his weathered face softened by an expression of pure wonder. "You look amazing," he said as she reached him. "So do you." The preacher, a new one who had replaced the drunk Reverend Whitmore, cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here to witness the marriage of Silas Cade and Ruth McAllister." He paused. "I understand this is technically a renewal of vows since the couple was legally married several months ago, but they have asked me to perform the ceremony again so that they can make their promises to each other freely and openly without secrets between them." Ruth met Silas's eyes. Without secrets. She had told him everything. Every shameful thing she had done as part of the Dalton gang. Every law she had broken. Every moment of weakness and fear. He had listened without judgment. And then he had asked her to marry him again. "Silas," the preacher continued, "do you take Ruth to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" "I do." Silas's voice was strong and clear. "I did before, and I do again. This time knowing exactly who she is and loving her all the more for it. And Ruth, do you take Silas to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part?" Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. "I do." She squeezed his hands. "I do, knowing that I don't deserve him, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife, again." The preacher smiled. "You may kiss your bride." Silas did not need to be told twice. The kiss was different from their first, the perfunctory touch that had sealed their legal marriage. This one was full of promise and passion and the fierce joy of two people who had fought through hell to find each other. When they finally broke apart, the crowd was cheering. "Ladies and gentlemen," the preacher announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Silas Cade." Ruth laughed as Silas swept her up in his arms and carried her through the crowd of well-wishers. "Put me down," she protested. "Not a chance." He carried her all the way to the house, where he finally set her on her feet in the doorway of their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cade." Ruth looked at him, at the cabin behind him, at the valley spread out below them. "Home," she repeated. The word had never felt so right. The celebration continued long into the evening. There was food and drink and music. There was dancing on the packed dirt of the yard. There were toasts and speeches and good-natured teasing. Through it all, Ruth felt like she was floating. 6 months ago, she had been a wanted woman, a fugitive, a ghost drifting through a life that didn't belong to her. Now she had a husband, a home, a community, a future. As the party wound down and the guests began to drift away, Cole approached her. "Mrs. Cade." He tipped his hat. "I wanted to say congratulations." "Thank you, Deputy." Ruth studied his face. "You look like you have something else to say." "I do." Cole shifted uncomfortably. "I wanted to apologize for hunting you, for assuming you were guilty without really investigating, for everything." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were doing your job. I understood that then, and I understand it now. That doesn't make it right." "No. But I forgive you anyway." Ruth extended her hand. "Fresh start?" Cole looked at her hand. Then, slowly, he took it. "Fresh start." He left shortly after, riding west toward his next assignment. Ruth watched him go with complicated feelings. He had been her enemy, her hunter, the man who had wanted to see her hang. Now he was something else. Not a friend exactly, but not an enemy either. Just another broken person, trying to find his way in a broken world. Like all of us, Ruth thought. The night deepened. The last guests departed. Ruth and Silas stood on the porch of their home, watching the stars emerge one by one. "Happy?" Silas asked. "More than I ever thought possible." He pulled her close. "You know I sent for a quiet wife, a modest woman who would cook my meals and keep my house and never cause any trouble." Ruth smiled. "And instead you got me. Instead I got you." He kissed her forehead. "Best mistake I ever made." Ruth laughed. "I love you, Silas Cade. I love you too, Ruth Cade." He took her hand and led her toward the door. "Now come to bed. We've got a lot of future to plan." Ruth followed him inside, closing the door on the past. Outside, the coyotes sang. Inside, two people who had been lost found home in each other's arms. And all was well. 1 year later, the Cade Ranch was unrecognizable. The herd had tripled in size. The house had grown, with 2 new rooms added to accommodate a growing family. The barn old Tom had risked his life to save the horses from was now the finest in the valley. But the biggest change was the sound of laughter that echoed across the property. Ruth stood on the porch, watching Silas chase their chickens across the yard, while pretending to be a terrifying monster. His growls were undermined by the smile splitting his face. "You are ridiculous," she called out. "I am effective." He grabbed the escaped hen and held her up triumphantly. "See? Captured." Ruth shook her head, laughing. A year ago, she would never have believed this moment was possible. A home, a husband who loved her, peace, and something else. Her hand went to the gentle swell of her belly, where a new life was growing. She had not told Silas yet, was waiting for the right moment. Tonight, she decided. Tonight, after dinner. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road. A single rider moving fast. Silas set down the chicken and reached for the rifle he kept by the door. Old habits died hard. But as the rider drew closer, Ruth recognized him. "Cole." "Deputy!" Silas lowered the rifle. "Didn't expect to see you back this way." Cole reined in his horse, his face drawn with exhaustion. Mr. Cade, Mrs. Cade, I apologize for arriving unannounced. I was in the area and thought I should stop by. You look like you could use a meal and a bed. Ruth stepped forward. Please come in. Cole hesitated. Then slowly he dismounted. Thank you, ma'am. I would appreciate that. Over dinner, Cole told them about his year. He had been promoted, was now a full marshal, not just a deputy. He had spent the year tracking down the scattered remnants of the Dalton gang, bringing justice to men who had escaped it for too long. I thought you should know. He looked at Ruth. We found Frank's brother. He was the one who gave Frank most of his orders, the one who planned the jobs. Ruth felt a chill run through her. And? He's dead, killed in a shootout in Colorado 2 months ago. Cole's voice was flat. The last of them. The Dalton gang is finished. Ruth sat in silence, processing. It was truly over. Every thread connecting her to her past life had been severed. Every ghost had been laid to rest. She was free. Truly, completely free. Thank you for telling me. Her voice was steady, but Silas's hand found hers under the table. I appreciate you coming all this way. Cole nodded. Then he looked at her more closely. You look different, Mrs. Cade, if you don't mind my saying. Ruth glanced at Silas, then back at Cole. I'm expecting, she said simply. The baby's due in the fall. Cole's eyes widened. Then, slowly, a genuine smile spread across his weathered face. Congratulations. To both of you. Thank you. Silas squeezed Ruth's hand. We're pretty excited. After dinner, Cole stood to leave. I should get back on the road. Still a lot of ground to cover. Stay the night. Ruth rose to walk him out. It's a long ride to anywhere from here. I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I've got responsibilities. He paused at the door. Take care of yourself and that baby. We will. He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. If you ever need anything, send word to the marshal's office in Santa Fe. I'll come running. Thank you, Deputy. He rode off into the gathering dusk, and Ruth watched until he disappeared over the horizon. Goodbye, she whispered. It felt like closing a chapter. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, Ruth Cade gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Hope. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She screamed when she was hungry and laughed when she was happy, and generally made it clear from day one that she would be a force to be reckoned with. She's perfect. Silas sat on the edge of the bed, cradling his daughter like she was made of glass. Absolutely perfect. She's going to be trouble. Ruth smiled, exhausted but radiant. I can already tell. Wonder where she gets that from. Ruth laughed. Certainly not from her quiet, respectable mother. Silas leaned over and kissed her. Thank you for what? For answering my advertisement, for coming all this way, for not being what I asked for. Ruth looked at her husband, at the baby in his arms, at the home they had built together. Cowboy wanted a quiet wife, she said softly. Got a wild one who rode him till dawn. Silas grinned. And he wouldn't have it any other way. Old Tom poked his head through the door, Clara close behind him. The baby is here? We heard crying. She's here. Ruth beckoned them in. Come meet Hope. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the tiny bundle in Silas's arms. Oh, Ruth. She's beautiful. She is. Ruth smiled. Would you like to hold her? Clara gathered the baby gently, cooing softly. Old Tom stood beside her, his weathered face soft with wonder. They made a strange family, Ruth thought. An ex-outlaw and a reformed ranger, an old vaquero and a saloon keeper, and now a baby girl who would grow up knowing none of the horrors her parents had survived. A family built from broken pieces, stronger for having been shattered. That's all any of us can ask for, Ruth thought. A chance to start again, a chance to be better, a chance to love and be loved in return. Outside, the sun was setting over the Cimarron Valley. painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, a family gathered around a new life, and all was well. Ruth closed her eyes and let the peace wash over her. She had spent 6 years running from her past. Now, finally, she could rest. She was home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.